what's up everybody? Welcome back to the Beastcoast Pokemon YouTube channel. We are here to discuss the North America International Championships that happened on 30th of June to July 2nd. It was a 3-day event with a ton of incredible international competition, and thank you so much for joining myself, James, Aaron, and Wolf to discuss the event. What did you guys think of it so far? I mean, Wolf and James, you both competed.
I have to sneeze so bad. I'm trying so hard not to sneeze. But yeah, it was a great event. It was run really well. It was hard. I mean, it's Nationals is always like the biggest North American event aside from Worlds when it's in North America. So I thought it was really neat. I thought the winning team was really cool. I thought the teams across the board were pretty neat. Yeah, it was a great event, both as a spectator and as a player. What do you think, James?
Mirroring that, because the event was really fun. I wasn't sure about how it was going to perform this weekend. We obviously, for those of you who don't know, there were a lot of like flight cancellations with weather problems and just like systems throughout the country. So we ended up missing out being one of the bigger events of the season. Still a really good time for anyone who was able to compete, and the smoke thankfully wasn't that bad from the wildfires. So had a lot more fun in Ohio than I had anticipated.
I got it on Wednesday. I think, yeah, Wednesday, and it was not great. I
heard it was bad Wednesday.
Yeah, but
it was pretty bad.
Good thing we spent all day inside anyway. So
we don't touch grass. It's fine.
But yeah, Aaron, I didn't think you went, but apparently you did. How was it?
Yeah, this is my first Nationals or NAIC that I have not competed or commentated in, which is kind of wild. Like, I've been to every single one of them since 2010. It's the first one since 2010. I'm in Chicago for the summer, and I figured haven't seen so many friends in so long, so I just flew by last second to hang out. It was definitely fun. I wish I could have stayed longer for finals on Sunday, but I caught a little bit of the juniors finals, which is honestly so remarkably hype, and we do definitely have to talk about that in this recap. It was a cool tournament. You know, I think just following from behind the scenes, I was really curious about, one, how like the day 2 race would pan out, and 2, just what kind of teams people would end up using. I think like NAIC is an event where people generally play pretty conservative and use teams that are fairly either standard or teams that they have a lot of familiarity with, although it's always fun to see the innovation that comes up on top. You know, Wolf, when you won in 2019, I think that was a really cool team, and I think Alex Gomez's team definitely felt one step ahead of a lot of the top teams in the meta, but a lot of players just used what they had been using for the last couple of months. So I always love just seeing kind of what comes to fruition at the end.
Well, I think something about the event in particular that also made it really interesting is it was the last event in Regulation C. So how do you guys feel like that affected the meta overall? Like, on top of comfort, did you feel like there were any other surprises that you felt people could pull from to really pull ahead at the event?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because on the one hand, like, you don't have people saving anything for Worlds, not like people normally do for NASC, but there's no reason to like hold back at all. But on the other hand, also like maybe like some people were playing Regulation D even before like NAIC started, even people competing, I know. And so it's hard to say exactly how it affected things, because on the one hand, it's like, oh, let me go all out, let me try like all my kind of off the wall ideas. But on the other hand, like, I wonder if like I be like understanding that this wasn't like the final format and that any learnings would kind of have to be stuck when this event ended. It wouldn't carry forward to such a drastically different format in Regulation D. I'm not sure like how, like if we would have gotten like a more or less developed NAIC if it had also been the Worlds format, you know?
Yeah, we saw a really cool evolution, I think, throughout like the teams and archetypes out there. The thing about, yeah, it was like a big pain, I think, to prepare for this tournament. I wonder if you had the same problem with Wolf, because I remember like talking to a bunch of friends. Showdown ladder and Battle Stadium ladder both were kind of deserted. It was really hard to find games. Like, I remember trying to search for a game for 15 minutes and I could not find any. So it was definitely not an easy event to prep for, but overall, like, I found it was like just again a really cool tournament in general. We saw some really good changes, and I think if this was the Worlds format, it would have been a really interesting preview of like what would have been to come.
One thing that I've thought a lot about is kind of metagame development, and I think because of the way the NA Day 2 race works, I think there's probably a little bit less innovation and development than you might expect to see. And the reason for that is because, you know, like the top 12 North American players are contending for a coveted spot at Day 2 Worlds. And the CP race this year was so close that I think as one of those top 12 players, for most people, especially if you're already in the top 8, you're incentivized to just stay there. And so like getting just any number of points or, you know, securing some points from an event is a really big deal. And as a result, I think it's a lot easier to get points if you use a team that you're more familiar with. And I think almost all, if not all, of the top 8 North American players going into this tournament just used the same team that they'd used at previous events, and most of them had stuck to this kind of same archetypes for the last couple of regionals going into NAIC as well. Top players and top finishes often drive metagame innovation, so I actually think like there wasn't too much meta development from the last couple of regionals going into NAIC, and most of the teams at NAIC I don't think were super crazy either. I do think two of the teams that stuck out to me more were Alex Gomez's team let one. I think him and Kyle Livinghouse worked on that together. And then the team let Wolf and Carson brought to the event, which was a new take on Dondozo with Flamigo, which I think a lot of people just weren't really preparing for throughout the season. But for the most part, I think it's telling when like the top players throughout the entire season are just like using what they had kept been using. I wonder how much like the race stifles metagame development, because I think when you're incentivized to just like get points rather than win an entire event, and when like the top players are the ones that often drive that kind of innovation, yeah, I'd say like there weren't too many surprises coming out in terms of teams. That being said, we still did have a pretty diverse set of teams in that final 8, which was always cool to see. Yeah, I think most of the teams that had done well definitely I'd expected to see, but I honestly have to say I did not have Ghost Tera Dragapult on my radar going into the events. Like I think there's a big reason why it won, and I think a lot of people just had not practiced against that specifically.
Well, especially when you look at just how Chien-Pao has evolved as one of the treasures of Ruin, I feel like everybody was like, okay, we've got Dragonite Chien-Pao. That is just the bread and butter of how you end up using Chien-Pao to its fullest. So when Alex ended up actually picking out the Dragapult, I was like, that's really smart. I didn't think Dragapult, even as a Pokemon, would be something that we would see a whole lot of in this first year of Scarlet and Violet. I don't know about you guys, but it just felt like, okay, well, ghost types are pretty weak from all the dark types that are on the meta. Dragapult's so fast, and that was one of the things about it in Sword and Shield that made it so good.
Yeah, not only its speed, I mean, the speed is appealing, but like I totally agree, because if you want to use Dragapult, your options for dragon moves are Dragon Darts, which like if the opponent doesn't protect or have a fairy type is not strong enough on either target given how frail Dragapult is. And then if you want to use a ghost move, you have to use Phantom Force, which requires a lot of prediction and like leaves you vulnerable. Like you can't protect the turn that you leave the, you know, their dimension. And Dragapult I like have kind of come back to a couple times throughout the season, but never with the choice band set, and it's always kind of underwhelming, like because it's like fast, but it doesn't have enough of that burst damage to actually do well, like unless you do Terra Ghost, Terra Blast, because now all of a sudden you have super powerful move that can like, yeah, just like immediately exert pressure on like Phantom Force, Dragon Darts, both of which are good supplemental moves but aren't like strong enough on their own. So I'm with Aaron. I prepared more for this event than I have for this entire season. I don't think I played against a single choice band Dragapult in practice. That was totally not on my radar, and it's, yeah, I think a lot of teams were not prepared for just like the absurd amount of damage and the lack of counterplay, right? You can't fake it out, you can't intimidate it, right? Those are kind of typical things we use to stop physical attackers, especially in conjunction with the speed. You can't outspeed it, right? Something like Fluttermane, which is good into Dragonite Chien-Pao, not so great into Dragapult Chien-Pao. So yeah, really, really cool voice, and I can totally see why it won.
Yeah, Alex and Kyle used the same team. They used slight different changes. Kyle Livinghouse ended up finishing top 16. Alex, of course, won the event. I thought there were like some pretty cool concepts to like things we've seen previously. The Dragapult, as we mentioned before, we saw it win actually the first regional over in Fort Wayne actually with Justin Tang, and he ran a steel type Terra Blast set, so of course you could catch the flutters, but with that extra power in the Terra Blast with the Terra Ghost, and then you have the Chien-Pao, you can basically KO most of the Fluttermanes even through like a Terra Fairy to be neutral to the Terra Blast. So it's still a really strong option. So I thought it was like really unique there. And then we saw like Ting-Lu Dondozo. We saw this combination also at that regional championship with Nick Navarre in top 4. It's been a very popular choice, especially in the Japanese meta. You would just be able to stall out a lot of factors. Ting-Lu Dondozo just able to sponge up attacks, and that was like really one of the main concepts I think of this team, instead of like Nick's version where it was like stealth rocks and then yawn spamming to basically force the opponent to switch out to lose momentum taking these stealth rocks damage. This was a different approach. We saw the Sand Tomb option instead with the yawn trapping with Dondozo to chip away your opponent's team with the Ruination afterward. I thought it was like a really unique strategy because you could set up, for instance, the Chien-Pao, the booster energy Fluttermane, that speed booster that can finish off weakened opponents, and then of course the Dragapult that can just dish out a lot of damage. So I thought it was like a really smart take on two concepts we've seen previously before, but kind of innovated in a new way.
Yeah, I think to add to that, like the Ghost Tera changes so much, right? The Steel Tera was used kind of defensively, also offensively, as you mentioned, against Fluttermane. Part of the reason, by the way, for like this win, I think, is that like Dragapult's a really difficult Pokemon to use, in my opinion, right? A lot of people default towards Dragonite plus Chien-Pao, and I think part of the reason for that is because of Dragonite's bulk plus multi-skill, it's its ability. You have more room to get away with if you, for example, lock into a bad move in the beginning of the game, because Dragonite often will survive an attack. The thing with Dragapult is like you have to be really intentional about which move you click, right? If you click Dragon Darts and like Wolf mentioned, it's not single target, then maybe you do a lot to both, but then you just get KO'd in return. Phantom Force is such a good move when used properly, but I think that's one of the hardest moves to use in the game. And credits to Alex, he found some really cool plays. I mean, that finals, like, oh my goodness, he made Dragapult look like one of the most broken Pokemon in the format, right? And so what a cool finals to be able to feature that. I felt like when Justin Tang won regionals with it, it was a cool Pokemon, but it wasn't like carrying the team necessarily. And not to say that like Dragapult was the only Pokemon carrying Alex's team. I think when you win a tournament like NAIC, every Pokemon obviously has its control. The point I'm trying to make is that like Justin Tang won regionals with it, but it wasn't very popular, right? That core afterwards, because it's just not that easy to use or execute. You give it to a player like Alex, who's one of the best, greatest of all time, plus he makes a slight tweak in just changing the Tera type, and suddenly you have this really strong set that very few people will have experience fighting against. I mean, I was shocked at some of the calcs, right? And I think he did such a good job of using Xianpao's ability in particular. I think a lot of people use the rune Pokemon and they're just good. I don't think that many people were like building around, okay, if I get that extra defense drop, what does it mean in terms of knockouts that I get? And it felt like Alex was just getting so many one-hit KOs that I personally wasn't expecting. I definitely agree with what James and Wolf are saying there. Ting-Lu Dondozo, I know that's something that Wolf ended up bringing as well. It's interesting because it felt like it picked up a lot of steam in the Japanese circuit, but there were so few North American players using it at the regional championships. So I feel like people still weren't that prepared for it going into NAIC, and the combination of Sandtomb and Yawn, like, having played against practice games with Wolf, it's like it can just single-handedly win a game early on, and it was super impressive. And so, yeah, I think once again, like, it's interesting to see differences in metagames, but those were two of the big things coming out. And I think MausApe was something that was always big on my radar. I always felt like it was underplayed, and then we saw, the MausApe Scream Tail, Golden Go, Talonflame core that really popped up, and I think that ended up performing incredibly well, really throughout the last couple of months, and also finished strong at NAIC.
Awesome to be able to see how Maushold and Annihilate had started to rise in popularity just a little bit. That was another one of those teams I felt like was a little bit more difficult to run, especially when you have some really bad matchups for that particular core in the meta, and it's also sometimes a little tough to position the Annihilate if it's in front of something that's super threatening. The differentiation in the Tera type for the Annihilate, and also just looking at some of its common partners, really cool to see the Screamtail added there too. But to touch on even just the Ghost Tera that we saw from the Dragapult, one of the other things in the meta that started to just pop up everywhere was the Iron Hands. Iron Hands wasn't super strong at the start of Regulation C, but by the time we ended up getting to NAIC, it was on 6 of the top 8 teams. That was not something I was super expecting.
Yeah, I feel like starting around, in my memory, it's around Hartford. It might have been a different event, but I feel like by the time Hartford rolled around, Iron Hands had been established as like probably the second best Paradox Pokemon behind Fluttermane, with like intention for maybe not being the most used, but being really, really strong. It's got like the best stats across the board, and its only real weakness is low speed stat, which can be used with Trick Room and isn't even always that much holding it back. It's a very, very strong mono. It wasn't just that Iron Hands rose in popularity. We saw all these different sets, right? We saw Safety Goggles, Swords Dance, Terra Fire. There were some other interesting sets as well throughout the metagame developing. One thing I want to point out, by the way, is Palafin. Palafin kind of disappeared from the like format pretty much. By the time mid-format rolled around, Palafin was like gone. Like it like was really not doing well at all. And then it got both second and I think 7th as well at the event, which I was personally surprised for. I kind of thought with the addition of Gyarados like becoming kind of the primary Intimidate user, I just really didn't think Palafin was going to be that strong anymore. Yeah, it had a resurgence and it almost won the whole event.
Yeah, I think Palafin was really solid in the meta there. I actually brought Palafin as well, and it's just something that Rain Palafin, we saw, of course, Gavin Michaels win in Series 2 or International Championship. It's really heavy hitting. We saw Azumarill Rain, of course, do really well, and there were several on day 2 with Gavin Michaels and Colin Hire. Palafin Rain, if you are able to set it up, it's just able to do so much damage with that Rain boosted Jet Punch, and I think that's like the main key point where Palafin you were able to set up, but it wasn't able to do enough damage towards the end game, and both of the Palafins we saw ended up clutching it out with Rain paired with Pelipper. So I thought that was like a huge difference in making it be able to shine in this tournament.
Yeah, it's funny because Wolf identified how strong Pelipper and Palafin were, but before EUIC. Wolf didn't play in EUIC, but he was helping myself and Aaron Trailer and Marcus prepare for the event. And Wolf was like, this duo is so dang strong. So we ended up using Pelipper Palafin at EUIC. Aaron made it to day 2. Marcus and I were eliminated in day 1. That duo was incredible. I think we ended up using a more offensive core where I had Iron Bundle and Shiyu instead of the Iron Hands and this Arcanine, right? And the bulkier core, I think, really helps out a lot. I think all of my losses were actually to Dondozo in that event in particular, right? And for example, there was the Grass Terror on Palafin on this team. There was Clear Smog on Amoonguss, I believe, which had obviously been trending upwards, and then Grass Terror on Iron Hands as well. Even back in April, like Pelipper Palafin, Wolf had convinced me just how good it was, and I think this defensive core to round things out really like took it to the top. I feel like a lot of people would just like stop preparing for Palafin as much, but yeah, in the rain, like this thing just does so much damage, especially with like Wave Crash, for example. Like there's something that really resists it, so it's cool to see that kind of come back. And yeah, Rose, your point on Iron Hands is a great one. Like 6 out of top 8, that is really wild. And I remember Wolf at some point in one of these recordings we had done a few months ago was like, this Pokemon is just so good. And I think it's funny to see the rise and fall of certain Paradox Mons. I felt like Great Tusk had a really good maybe couple of events, and then it's like fallen off a little bit. Still strong. I mean, Joseph Garte ended up finishing in the top 4 with the same Sun team that he won regionals with. Yeah, it's just funny to see hands pop up. I think in the end, I'm like looking at the top 8 teams from this tournament, and there was a fair amount of diversity, right? We had the Dragapult Champao win. We had 2 of the different Palafin Rain teams piloted by Rogov and Jody. We had a bunch of players who relied on comfort. So Joe using the Sun team like he had won Portland regionals with. Chuppa Cross, who has had a phenomenal season, by the way. He hasn't gotten a victory, but he's top cut like it feels like every event. He was one of the more Dondozo-centric players and then pivoted to Talonflame Hyper Offense. We had 2 of the balanced teams with, you know, Gyarados, Chiyu, Amoonguss, Ting-Lu, Flutter. And then the 8th place team, I think, was easily one of, if not the coolest team to come out of the event. Justin Knox using Iron Moth, Gyarados, Golden Gold, Grimmsnarl, Hands, and Fluttermane. Wolf, I know you actually played against this team, but that is not a team I would not have bet on Iron Moth finishing in the top 8 of NAIC, that's for sure.
What a weird Paradox Pokemon to really see come out of that. We still haven't seen a whole lot of Iron Thorns or Slitherwing. That's feels like an unfortunate set of circumstances to just not see those Pokemon in particular have very good results. When you also look at these top 8 teams, there's a little bit of differentiation, obviously, like balance versus hyper offense. Where were you guys on the fence of kind of where you thought those teams would fall in the meta? I was not super sold on hyper offense personally, just seeing how much balance was running around in the bowl.
Yeah, I would say that like the longer a format goes on, the harder times hyper offensive teams tend to have, and the better times balanced teams have to have. I actually was a little surprised that, I wouldn't say hyper offense, but the teams on the whole were a bit more aggressive than I was expecting. I think Alex's team has this great defensive back. Dragapult plus Chenpao is just so offensive. A lot of the teams, I guess, like were more defensive oriented like we expected, but like Joe's team is obviously, I would say, more leaning towards hyper offense. Marco Fierro's team as well was like, it wasn't hyper offense, like he had this great defensive core. Yeah, actually I feel like a lot of the teams basically like used good defensive backbones to support their aggression. Like I think that's kind of the difference between now and early format, whereas in early format it was kind of all offense all the time, and at NAIC these were refined. Like Choppa's team, like it has a lot of really aggressive pieces. Specs Dango, Dragonite, Chenpao, Iron Bundle, Talonflame, like all these Pokemon are aggressive. None of them are especially bulky at all. The typing and the way that he played it and the way like that he just like maneuvered them allowed them to, like, at least having played against him twice, it was really hard to knock out these key pieces despite him having so much aggression. The offensive teams got really refined by the end of the season. Like they were still offensive, but they just had so much more backbone to them than we would have seen early on.
Yeah, I think we saw like just, you know, a few slight changes like we normally do to like already proven solid teams, and they're just able to perform well. For instance, we could look at the top 16 teams. One of the most common teams we actually saw was the MausApe stuff with Mousehold, Annihilate, Screamtail, the Encore Disable set, a Life Orb, Talonflame, Fluttermane, and then this time they replaced the Golden Gold that used to be on the team that Zach did use to get top 4 at the Fresno Regional Championship and win that special event. Instead, replacing it with the King Gambit. Him, Henry Rich ran the same team, and Leonard Kraft actually ran a pretty similar team. Ended up running Shien Pao with Sword Stance instead, but really a very similar concept. It's just interesting to see like slight changes and how far it can take the team. And then we see like Sohybe and Eric Rios as well in the top 16 running basically a very similar team to what Emilio Forbes used to win the Fresno Regional Championship as well. And we see like an Orthworm team, the only really high placing Orthworm team that got 12th place, and it ends up making a few changes. There's actually a lot of like Terra Poisons on the Rotom Wash, and I believe it's also the Ting-Lu as well. And then it's you and Carson Comfort running a Parish Dondozo team as well. So that was a really unique bring to this event.
It was interesting. I feel like Dondozo Tatsu has finished top 8 of every event this season, and this was actually, I think, the first event, or maybe not the first, but one of the main events I can think of where it didn't. Wolf, yourself, and Carson coming obviously super close to making it to the top 8. I'm always curious about Dondozo Tatsu, especially because like Clear Smog Amoonguss felt like it was picking up everywhere, but then one of the innovations was then to run Steel Terra on Dondozo to kind of get around that, which is, I know, what you guys brought, Wolf. I think other than that, most of the archetypes in the top 16 were things that, yeah, once again, I would have expected to see. And it's funny, it's like if you asked me to bet on whether or not, you know, those top 16 players, like whether or not that would be the exact team they'd bring into NAIC or whether they'd be using like something super similar, for most of them, I feel like I could guess that it would be that, because a lot of them were established players that had already been using those archetypes throughout the season. And we've had this discussion more in recent years than ever, which is like the idea of like comfort versus the call, especially after the World Championships last year when Edu won like undefeated using a team that he'd been using for months. And I think it's interesting to now like think about that more than ever. And I notice it more than ever when when the top, 12 to 16 players are often using the same archetypes that they brought to multiple events. So just interesting, like something I haven't really thought about too much before, and I feel like I've really now seen it more in the last couple of seasons, and I wonder if part of that is because of how intense like the race for the day 2 invite and the stipend is. But yeah, overall, a lot of cool teams. I think Screamtail and Pokemon is really, really interesting. There was a lot of Screamtail looking even beyond the top 16 that people were using. So very curious if that translates to success in Regulation D, but I guess part of the thing about this event is a cool send-off to this format. I don't know how many learnings you can really take from it into Worlds this summer, which will be such a different format.
I cannot wait to see what's going to happen with Regulation D, as that is just around the corner. When you look at Regulation C, we got a chance to see a lot of meta development for the balanced teams, how those evolved over the course of the format. Also, the circle of weather. We saw like rain super dominant at the beginning, and then it was sun, and then we got sand, and now it's rain again. But one archetype in particular that I feel like didn't super take off was Heart Trick Room. That was one I felt like got a lot of difficulty to be able to set up, and a lot of people had great answers to it. Let's talk about that juniors finals. Aaron, you brought that up as one of the highlights of the North American International Championships. That was a fun match to watch. Avery actually bringing the Hard Trick Room there.
Yeah, I think Hard Trick Room is so good in juniors in particular, right? Because it's like you have a game plan. If you execute the game plan, you can win very quickly. And it's like Oranguru is such a funny Pokemon, right? We like have barely seen it succeed in the Masters division, but it's done so well in juniors because just getting a second really powerful spread move is really strong. I love that finals. I started playing VGC when I was in the juniors division, right? And I think I always wish, especially like when I was a senior in like 2011, 2012, I was like, oh, I wish like more people like watched my games, especially when they used to have all the games simultaneously. So Wolf and I would be sitting next to each other. He'd be playing in Masters finals and I'm in senior finals, and obviously the Masters finals is a little more hype. But yeah, I think it's just what I love about Pokemon. Rose, you and I were there at OCIC in 2020 when it was like one of the most adorable finals, and there was like a little Eevee plush that she was holding like during her winners interview, and it was just so adorable. So I love seeing the younger divisions get hyped, and that finals was honestly really cool. Like we saw the same lead, I think all 3 games, and the same turn 1 all 3 games, but then everything else was like a little bit different. Yeah, Avery's interview was so cute. Like the one quote I keep thinking about is, "Tell us about your Oranguru," and he's like, "It doesn't do any damage." And so point being, I thought it was an awesome finals, and yeah, like Hard Trick Room a little bit easier to execute in juniors because of the raw power of it. Avery's opponent Takumi was also really good and actually brought a team that I think is really difficult to use in juniors. It was solo Dondozo plus Ting-Lu. Like I think that's really difficult to use because of the amount of time it takes to like actually get things going with that. Like games can go on for a long period of time. So yeah, I think Takumi played a really good finals as well. It just makes me really happy to give the younger division some hype.
Yeah, I think the seniors division finals was actually really good as well. Like really close, great 3 games. Masters finals was pretty just a masterclass by Alex. Like he just understood, which was interesting because Kyle actually played Rogov with the same team, and he actually said he really struggled in that matchup. So it was just really interesting because Alex approached it a different way. Yeah, so it was like a really interesting, unique way of like end up like playing a bit differently with a different game plan, and he was able to execute it flawlessly. But overall, what are your final thoughts concluding this NAIC recap and the end of Regulation C? I wondered what y'all thought. I think that this was like a really good event. A lot of amazing teams, a lot more Screamtail and MausApe than I would have imagined really showing up. There's like a huge amount of them in the day 2s position as well, but basically this is what I would expect to see for the most part. This team, a lot of different diversity, a lot of different strategies, and pretty much the Pokemon you would really expect. Not too many surprises, I think, but a really good amount and fun format overall. I would have loved to see this development for Worlds. We are moving on to Regulation D, but how did you all think about Regulation C and its conclusion?
Yeah, I think I would have loved to see it play out more. I would have liked more if it was the Worlds format, or at least something more similar. Maybe add the Hisuian Pokemon in. But yeah, I think it was a really cool format. I think like it was really cool to see it develop. I feel like it developed really quickly. Like we went from like Palafin was the king, and then Palafin disappeared and had a resurgence. Yeah, I would have liked to see more of it, but overall I think it was a cool format with a lot of different viable teams and archetypes and strategies, and yeah, like I overall enjoyed it.
I think for me, what NAIC showed me is let the best players are just so dang good. Like you think about like the top 12 North American players going into this event in terms of championship points. I think pretty much almost everyone, if not everyone, managed to make it to day 2 of the competition, which is wild in itself. And then so many of those players also were in the top 8 or in the top 16. I mean, Alex won the event, right? And he's one of the greatest players of all time. And it was actually really cool watching his interview because he's like, I haven't won a title, since I think he said like 2016 or 17. And yeah, I think he was almost going to retire after Worlds last year. And then he's back and he, it comes out full force. So that was a really cool storyline. Yeah, I think this World Championship this year is going to be crazy. Like the high level of players today is just so good. That's really been proven by the top players from North America this year. I think it's North America in particular has had a tremendous season, honestly, like winning the first 2 ICs and obviously finishing second here as well. And so I think going into Worlds, I'm really excited to watch that in particular. It's funny because I feel like everything kind of just came in a full circle at the end, right? It's like Palafin ends up being very good. Everyone was talking about it in the beginning. It fell off, but now ends up finishing second. Dragapult Champal wins the first regionals of the season. People kind of just forget about it and stop using it, and it ends up winning as well. Yeah, it's kind of funny to see how metagames can sometimes develop, but also come back to where things started just with like some slight innovations. Yeah, once again, like Pokemon is such a deep game, and all it takes is one move change, one Tera change, an EV spread change, an item change, and that can dramatically, change how a strategy is actually played out. So at the end of the day, it's like the strategies that did end up on top, even though a lot of them were discovered earlier on, some slight tweaks were able to really take them across the finish line. In terms of Reg C, it was fun. I think it felt like the format, I wouldn't say it was solved towards the end, but like there were a couple of very clear established archetypes. Balance, for example, Dondozo compositions, the hyper offense, like Tailwind teams that, for example, James Evans had piloted throughout the entire season, just to name a couple. The MausApe stuff that I really picked up towards the end. It felt like there weren't too many like crazy new team comps. I thought Grimmsnarl was interesting just because it was on my radar, and Grimmsnarl did end up making the top 8, but wasn't like represented that much. Point being, nothing too crazy. I think the craziest thing honestly was that Iron Mod team in top 8, and then Wolf and Carson's Dondozo team. Those were both really new innovations. What I would have expected to see for the most part. Yeah, I think for me it's more about the players than anything. Like the best players are so good, and I can't wait to see what everyone cooks up for Worlds.
Yeah, let's throw Regulation C out the window. That's gone. We're done with that. Regulation D brings a whole new slate of opportunities for everyone to be able to play around with, and I'm pretty confident that 2023 we just might get a player from the United States or North America winning the World Championships again.
Ooh.
I'm here for it. I know we haven't had one since you won, Wolf, in 2016, so
2022 was for suckers. 2023 is for wolves. That's all I gotta say
James
about
has
it.
come so close as well. James.
I know. What? Hey, one of you two. I bet it was gonna happen. I know,
believe
Aaron.
day
you
one
qualified
brothers.
too,
We're making
so.
it through.
We're making this day 2. We're making the cut, Wolf. But
Heck yeah.
thank you to everyone who watched this episode of Beastcoast talking about NAIC. Hope you all enjoyed. Leave a like down below. It really does show your support, and we'll be back for more Regulation D next time.